What happens when God speaks to you and you don't even believe that He actually speaks in the first place? Today, I want to talk about the fact that it is essential to hear the voice of God in order to fulfill your purpose and your calling. And today, I have a fun story to actually share with you about a young man in Argentina who was a leader for a national denomination, worldwide denomination, but he was the leader for that nation, one of the leaders. And God spoke to him in a powerful way. Now, if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Shane, and I love to talk about hearing the voice of God, making it practical so that you can live out the lifestyle God has called you to live. So if you want to hear more about prophecy and about revival, then you're welcome to join the channel. But today I really want to focus in on one part of this story that I think is essential for us to hear today, and that's the fact that sometimes we think in order to understand your calling, you need to take a personality test. You need to find out what your passions are and those things. And I'm not against those things. I think they have their place. But what's really powerful about this story is that this young man didn't believe the voice of God, and he was considering quitting something that was impacting at least 100,000, 180,000 people on a regular basis. And I think it's such a sweet picture of the fact that God wants to speak to us in our personal lives on very concrete matters. He's not vague and he's not limited in his way of speaking. And so this is a very powerful story. So I can't wait to talk about it. Now, while we were in Argentina, we were there ministering at different places, different churches, locations. And at one of those locations, this is where this sort of thing happens, where I'm sitting with my good friend Tabitha, and we begin praying for this young man and begin to pray what we feel like God is speaking to us about him. And we don't really know anything about what's happening, but what happened next was quite special, especially after hearing from his friend what had happened. But these are the things we had started to pray for, that this young man was called to street evangelism, and that he would find a creative way of bringing the gospel in a way that no one had done before, through things like even creative murals and through using social media. Particularly, Tabitha had mentioned things like YouTube, and that God wanted to father him where he was at, and that he had a unique calling as a teacher, but also to evangelize. And so as we are sharing these things, this young man just begins breaking down, crying, weeping. And he says, "This is impossible," but he says it in Spanish. And he's just crying and weeping. And God is doing something in his heart that we don't have a clue about. We just know we're going to be faithful with what God is saying right then in that moment. Now, afterwards, we found out that this young man was an established leader for a particular denomination, and you would know it if I'd mentioned it. But the irony in this situation is that he didn't actually believe that God speaks. His friend brought him there and wanted us to pray for him, but he didn't believe God speaks. And as we're giving these words, they are so specific, and he knows it's God, and he says it's impossible. He knows this is impossible. He doesn't even believe this, but God is speaking to him about specific situations. And his friend begins to explain how this young man was actually considering quitting a YouTube channel that he had of 80,000 followers. And he also had an Instagram of 100,000. We had prophesied over social media influence and things like this, and with YouTube and things like that, and that God would use it to actually share the gospel with people. Well, ironically, his last video was actually about God's existence. And this isn't a channel that he would use to talk about that, but his last one was about that. And he was very discouraged, and he was actually the night before considering quitting his channel and dropping it completely. And the next day, we wind up prophesying how God is actually going to use him to bring salvation through through social media and evangelization. And in that moment, what's powerful about this situation is that you can't deny that God speaks in this. Like, you can have a theological construct for, yeah, I don't believe God speaks, but when he speaks, he speaks. And there's no amount of arguing that we would need to do to even have to prove it. Because in that moment, God was speaking very clearly and telling him, you are my son and I love you and I know you and I want to give you direction on your life. And it just transformed his life. Now, I don't know exactly what happened after that. I don't know the impact that it has, but I would imagine that that sort of situation will change your life forever. But I want to talk about 3 things that I think we can really learn from this situation that I believe is going to apply for you wherever you're at. And the first one is this, that we sometimes focus on what we can tangibly, concretely touch, like personality profiles and logical wisdom. And there is a very important place for those things. Like Proverbs talks about gathering wisdom at whatever cost. But there's a very, very essential part in our walk with God where we actually need to say, Lord, what are you speaking? Because there's a left way to go, there's a right way to go. And it's the voice of God that actually gives us clear direction. And if we're not careful, we can lean so heavily on practical application wisdom and personality profiles and things like that, that we actually miss out on the fact that things like our calling and the things that God wants us to do in our life are not matters of just personality. You may not even have the personality for what God is calling you to do. But what's important is that we actually seek the voice of God because God wants to lead you in a particular direction. So don't forget that. And I would say, in the midst of a world where personality profiles and different things like that are championed, I want to encourage you, seek the voice of God for your life. Get to know him, because it's in a conversation with God that we can actually live with focus in our lives. And if you want to be successful, if you want to actually make a difference in the world, then you have to seek the voice of God. You have to seek a relationship with him above everything else. Number 2, I would say this, just because it doesn't feel like God is speaking to you in your season, or maybe you've never felt like God speaks, doesn't mean he doesn't want to speak to you. In the case with this young man, God was not angry with him. This young man didn't have a construct for the idea that God even speaks. And so naturally, if God were to speak, he may not have been listening. But when someone else came into his life, particularly us, and we listened to God for his life, that was a game changer for him. And so I want to encourage you. You may not be in a season where you feel like God is speaking. Pursue other people where hearing the voice of God seems a little bit easier. And even if it's a seasonal thing, I would just encourage you to continue to pursue hearing the voice of God. And maybe God is speaking to you in a different way in this season. And so whatever that looks like, just make sure it's a priority for you, that you surround yourself with at least one person that is continually practicing hearing the voice of God. And number 3, I want to say that the greatest gift that you can give yourself for your future is actually to pursue conversations with God, pursue dialogue with God, and pursue the heart of God. I think one of the most powerful parts of this story is that this young man knew that God knew him. In a moment of time, it was like God came in and said, young man, I actually know you and I love you. And I have very specific things to say about the challenges that you're experiencing, the disappointments. And I want to say that God wants to father us, not just to say, hey, do this or do that, and then leave you to your own devices to figure it out. But he actually wants to say, you know what? I love you. I know you. And I think one of the most powerful words within that entire thing was that God wanted to father him. And I think that is so critical for us, that if we want to actually make a difference in the world, God actually has something to say to that. God created us to make a massive impact. He's the one he owns everything, right? So God himself actually is not trying to limit you. So God wants to actually speak to you on a personal level. And if you want to make a difference in the world, you want to make an impact, start there. Start in a deep relationship with your Father, because that's what it's all about in the first place. So I want to leave you with this challenging. What are you pursuing in your life? Is God sort of a second option where, you go to God if you need something, or are you actually pursuing relationship with God, conversation with God on a daily basis? I want to encourage you find the areas that maybe you're actually avoiding bringing God into the conversation, and begin to start that dialogue, because that place of having intimate relationship with Jesus is where we are transformed and we're able to really live out the calling that God has for us. But I want to ask you, what was your favorite piece of input or wisdom? Type down in the comments below. And I'd love to hear also, if you could give any piece of advice, what would it be? I'd love to hear and actually chat with you down. I love the comments and the encouragements from everybody in the past. It's been awesome. So guys, thank you so much for listening. And if you want to hear more content like this about how to actually hear the voice of God, then subscribe, because in the future videos, I'm actually going to be talking about practically how do you actually attune your voice to recognizing what God is saying, when he's speaking, and really wisdom for how to respond properly when God does speak. So with that, guys, have a great day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.